started as an ordinary Thursday. I was heading back from a long day at work, ready to collapse on the couch with some leftover pizza and a mindless TV show. The drive to my neighborhood was uneventful, the kind of commute you forget as soon as you park. When I pulled into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was the open front door. I live alone in a modest single-story house on a quiet suburban street. The door had been locked when I left that morning. I was sure of it. I always double-check. My first instinct was to call the police. I pulled my phone out, but before I could dial, I convinced myself it wasn't a break-in. Maybe I'd left it open and just thought I'd locked it. Maybe the wind had blown it open, though there hadn't been any wind. After a moment's hesitation, I grabbed the tire iron from my trunk and stepped out of the car. My heart pounded as I approached the door, my grip tightening on the cold metal. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed slightly, unnervingly loud in the quiet street. No answer. The house was dark inside, except for the faint orange glow of the setting sun filtering through the blinds. I reached the door and peeked inside. Nothing seemed out of place. I stepped in cautiously, turning on the lights as I went. The living room was exactly as I'd left it. Couch, coffee table, a stack of magazines I kept meaning to recycle. The kitchen was the same too, though I noticed the faint smell of something metallic, like rust. By the time I checked every room and found nothing amiss, I felt foolish. I must have forgotten to close the door. It wasn't like me, but everyone has an off day. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as I locked the door, double-checking it this time, and sat down on the couch. The tire iron stayed within arm's reach. The next morning, I noticed the first real sign that something was wrong. I'd been in a rush to leave for work, scrambling to get out the door, when I spotted it. A cup on the kitchen counter that I hadn't used. It was one of my coffee mugs, clean but damp inside, as if it had been recently rinsed. I hadn't used that mug in weeks. The uneasy feeling from the night before returned, but I brushed it off again. Maybe I'd forgotten I used it. People forget things. I told myself that all day at work, but when I got home that evening, another detail stood out. The living room rug had been moved slightly, just enough for me to notice. And then, in the bathroom, I found the soap dispenser in the shower had been knocked over. It wasn't the kind of thing you forget. I slept poorly that night, the feeling of unease growing into full-blown paranoia. The next day, I decided to set a trap. Before leaving for work, I placed a piece of tape on the front door, pressing it so it connected the door to the frame. If anyone opened the door, the tape would tear, and I'd know. I also scattered a few items in strategic places: keys on the counter, a pen on the coffee table, a book on the arm of the couch. I memorized their exact positions. When I returned that evening, I saw the tape on the door had been broken. My stomach dropped. Inside, the keys had been moved. The pen was on the floor, and the book was missing entirely. I searched every room, every closet, every corner. No one was there. The house was empty, but someone had been inside. I called the police this time. 2 officers came, walking through the house and listening to my story. They looked skeptical but professional. "There's no sign of forced entry," one of them said, gesturing toward the lock. "And you're sure you didn't forget to lock the door?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. They took a report, told me to call if anything else happened, and left. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I changed the locks, set up cameras inside and out, and tried to go about my life as normally as possible. The cameras helped. Every night I checked the footage, and every night I saw nothing. For a while, I started to believe it was over, that whoever had been in my house had moved on. But then, one night, the power went out. I was in the middle of brushing my teeth when everything went dark. At first, I thought it was a neighborhood-wide outage, but when I looked outside, I saw the streetlights were still on. The power was out in my house only. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to navigate to the breaker box in the garage. When I opened it, I saw that the main switch had been flipped. Someone had cut the power manually. I slammed the switch back on, flooding the house with light. My heart raced as I scanned the cameras on my phone, desperate for any sign of who had done it. Then I saw it. On the footage from the backyard camera, I spotted a figure standing by the fence. It wasn't the shadowy shape of some stranger. It was me. Someone had been standing in my yard, wearing my jacket, with my face turned toward the camera. But it wasn't me. I ran outside, clutching the tire iron again, but by the time I got there, the yard was empty. The fence was closed, the gate locked. The figure was gone. I moved out the following week, breaking my lease and leaving half my furniture behind. To this day, I don't know who it was or why they chose me. But every so often, I'll wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain I've heard a noise. I've always been an outdoorsy person, hiking, camping, exploring the quiet of the woods. Those were the things that brought me peace. But one weekend trip to Clearwater Trail changed how I see the wilderness forever. Clearwater was a small, out-of-the-way hiking spot about 3 hours from my apartment. It wasn't particularly popular, and that was part of its charm. No crowds, no noise, just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I left on a Saturday morning, arriving around 9 a.m. The parking lot was nearly empty except for 2 other cars. Perfect, I thought. I'd packed light, just water, a map, a small first aid kit, and some snacks. The trail was serene, a narrow dirt path winding through dense forest. The air was crisp, the kind of fresh you only get far away from the city. I passed a couple coming back toward the parking lot about an hour in. They were the first people I'd seen, and they waved as they passed. "Beautiful day for a hike," the man said. I smiled and nodded. "Enjoy the rest of it." After that, I was alone. About 2 hours into the hike, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, the left path led to a scenic overlook about a mile away. The right path looped back toward the parking lot. I chose the overlook. The trail narrowed even further, and the trees grew denser, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The quiet was almost oppressive. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent. Then I saw it, a backpack lying just off the trail. It was an older model, faded and frayed at the edges. Curious, I stepped closer. The contents were scattered: a water bottle, a couple of granola bars, a map similar to mine, and a notebook. There was no sign of the owner. I hesitated. It felt wrong to just leave it there, but something about the scene unsettled me. Maybe it was the way the notebook was lying open, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze, or the fact that the granola bars were still sealed, untouched. I picked up the notebook, glancing at the first few pages. Most of it was mundane, notes about the trail, sketches of trees and rocks. But the last entry caught my eye. "Saw him again. He's not following the trail, just watching from the trees. Don't know if I should head back or wait until he leaves." My stomach twisted. I scanned the woods, suddenly hyper-aware of every rustling leaf and snapping twig. I told myself it was just a joke, something someone had written to mess with whoever found the notebook. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I put the notebook back and hurried toward the overlook. The view was breathtaking, but I couldn't enjoy it. My mind kept drifting back to the notebook, to the ominous words scrawled on that last page. Who was him? A hiker? A figment of someone's imagination? As I turned to head back, I froze. A man was standing at the edge of the trail, about 50 feet away. He wasn't moving, just watching me. He was dressed in dark clothing, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about his stillness sent a chill through me. I forced myself to walk toward him, my heart pounding. As I got closer, I called out, "Hey, you okay?" He didn't respond. When I was about 20 feet away, he finally moved, turning and walking back the way he'd come. I didn't follow. Instead, I waited until he was out of sight before continuing down the trail. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the trail curved or the trees thinned, I found myself scanning the area, expecting to see the man again. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was starting to set. My car was the only one left. I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I backed out, my headlights swept across the lot. That's when I saw him again, standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the trailhead. I didn't wait to see what he'd do. I sped out of the lot, my hands shaking on the wheel. I reported the encounter to the local sheriff's office the next day. They took my statement but didn't seem overly concerned. "Probably just a homeless guy or someone camping illegally," the deputy said. "We'll send someone out to check the trail." A week later, I got a call. They'd found the owner of the backpack, or rather, what was left of him. The deputy didn't give me details, just that the man had been missing for weeks and that his body had been discovered deep in the woods, far from the trail. No sign of the man I'd seen, but I knew he was out there. I haven't been back to Clearwater Trail since. They say life can change in an instant, but I never truly understood what that meant until the night my world turned upside down. It was a Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every way, until it wasn't. I work at a mid-sized IT company, mostly remote, but I make the occasional trip to the office to stay connected with the team. That day, I'd left the office around 6:30 p.m., later than usual because of a last-minute system update. It was November, and the sun had long since set, leaving the world cloaked in darkness. The drive home should have been simple, a straight shot down Route 82 to the suburbs where I lived. But somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong. The first thing I remember is the faint hum of my car engine, then the sharp jolt as my eyes snapped open. I was still in my car, but it wasn't moving. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I looked around, disoriented. The clock on the dashboard read 12:47 a.m. 12:47? Panic coursed through me. How had I lost nearly 6 hours? I tried to calm myself, taking stock of my surroundings. The car was parked on the side of a narrow, winding road surrounded by thick woods. There were no streetlights, just the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. This wasn't Route 82. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't in its usual spot on the passenger seat. Frantically, I checked my pockets, the floor, even under the seats, but it was gone. My breathing quickened as I tried to piece together how I'd ended up here. The last thing I remembered was leaving the office and merging onto the highway. After that, nothing. I turned the key in the ignition, relieved when the engine roared to life. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but there were no signs, no landmarks, just endless forest. I put the car in drive and started moving, hoping the road would lead me back to civilization. As I drove, I noticed something odd. The fuel gauge showed a full tank, which didn't make sense. I'd filled up the day before, but I'd driven at least 30 miles to the office that morning. It was a small detail, but it gnawed at me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light in the distance. Relief washed over me as I approached a small gas station. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Faded signs, peeling paint, and a single flickering bulb above the entrance. Still, it was a lifeline. I pulled up to the pump, parked, and stepped out. The cold night air bit at my skin as I approached the building. Inside, an older man stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. He looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from boredom to mild curiosity. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound composed. I think I got lost. Can you tell me where we are? He raised an eyebrow. You're on Route 29. Closest town's about 15 miles east. Route 29? That was nearly 50 miles from where I should have been. Do you remember passing a town called Ridgefield? He asked, eyeing me. I shook my head. No, I don't even know how I got here. I was driving home from the city on Route 82, and then, I don't know. The man studied me for a moment, then shrugged. People get turned around out here all the time. Roads look the same, especially at night. I didn't argue. It didn't feel like a simple case of getting lost, but I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. I thanked him, bought a bottle of water, and got back in my car. The drive home was uneventful, but my mind was racing. How had I ended up so far off course? Why couldn't I remember anything after leaving work? When I finally pulled into my driveway, it was nearly 3 a.m. The house was dark, and my wife, Kate, was asleep. I decided not to wake her, instead slipping into bed and trying to make sense of the night's events. The next morning, things got stranger. My phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, fully charged. I was certain I hadn't brought it inside when I got home. Curious, I unlocked it and checked the call log. There were no outgoing calls, but I'd received several missed calls and texts from Kate. Her last message read, "Where are you? Are you okay? Please call me." I showed her the messages over breakfast, explaining what had happened. She looked concerned but didn't press me for details. "You should see a doctor," she said. "It could have been a medical episode." I agreed, though I wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, more unsettling details came to light. My car, which I'd washed the weekend before, was covered in dried mud, as though I'd driven through a swamp. The floor mats were damp, and there was a faint, earthy smell I couldn't place. I also found a strange key in the glove compartment. It was small and unmarked, unlike any key I'd seen before. I went to the doctor, who ran a battery of tests. Everything came back normal. No signs of head trauma, no neurological issues, nothing that could explain the missing hours. By then, I was convinced something had happened during that time, something I couldn't remember. I tried retracing my steps, driving back to the gas station on Route 29. But when I arrived, the place looked different, newer. The peeling paint was gone, the lights were bright, and there was a digital sign displaying gas prices. I asked the clerk about the older man who'd helped me, but she didn't know who I was talking about. "This station's been remodeled for years," she said. Weeks turned into months, and the mystery remained unsolved. I stopped telling people about it because no one believed me. They all chalked it up to exhaustion or stress. But I knew it wasn't that. I still have the key sitting in a drawer in my office. I've tried searching online for similar keys, but I haven't found anything. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring at it, wondering what it unlocks, wondering if I'll ever remember what happened during those missing hours. It was just after 10 p.m. when I received the last delivery of my shift. I was getting tired, but it was a quick one, just a pizza to a house a few miles away. I tossed my jacket over the passenger seat, made a quick U-turn, and drove off, turning the radio to my usual station. The streets were eerily empty, just how I liked it. No one to bother me as I wrapped up the night. When I hit the intersection at Oakwood Avenue, I noticed the light was red. No big deal, I thought, waiting as it seemed to stretch longer than usual. I wasn't really paying attention when a car slowly pulled up beside me. A beat-up silver sedan, its windows so darkly tinted that I couldn't make out a single silhouette inside. It pulled up and stopped right next to me, and I felt a slight unease. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The car just sat there, the engine running, its headlights dimmed. I looked over for a second but quickly turned back to the light. I couldn't explain why, but something about that car, the stillness of it, felt off. A few moments later, the light turned green, and I drove off, making a left onto the next street. I glanced into my rearview mirror, expecting the car to follow, but it stayed behind at the light. Good, I thought. Probably just some random driver. I shook it off. The delivery was supposed to be at the end of an isolated road, and as I turned into the neighborhood, the quietness was almost oppressive. Only a few houses lined the street, each with their lights off, no one in sight. Felt strange, like something was wrong. It didn't help that every house was new, freshly built, but they looked completely deserted. I pulled up to the address, 1572 Oakwood, and parked in front of the house. I looked up at the darkened windows. No porch lights, no movement. It looked like no one had been here in months, but the house still looked brand new. I grabbed the pizza and walked to the door. Knocked. The door swung open a bit. I wasn't expecting that. I knocked again, a little harder, but no one answered. I called out, "Pizza delivery," but there was no response. I checked the time. Maybe they were just late getting to the door. I pushed the door open just a little, thinking I could leave the pizza inside. The place was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, nothing. I even checked the hallway, but all I saw were bare walls. No sign anyone had ever lived there. I stepped back, unsure what to do next. Maybe it was a prank, but then something caught my eye. Down the road, where I just turned in, I saw a car parked at the edge of the street. I didn't recognize it at first, but as I got closer, I realized it was the same silver sedan from earlier, and it was parked a lot closer to me now. That familiar sense of unease washed over me again, but I tried to keep my cool. I started to walk back to my car, but as I did, I noticed something odd through the reflection of the window. The back seat. It looked like someone was sitting there. I froze. I couldn't make out any details, but the figure was clearly there. My heart started pounding in my chest. Then I heard the car door creak open behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see who it was or what they were planning. I turned and ran back up the porch steps, my pulse hammering in my ears. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, telling them I thought someone was following me, that I felt unsafe. I stayed by the door, hoping I wouldn't have to deal with whoever was lurking around. I didn't hear any footsteps, but a few minutes later, I saw the shadow of a figure walking down the street in my direction. I wanted to run, but I couldn't risk turning my back again. My legs felt like lead. Police arrived shortly after. They asked questions and checked the area, but there was no sign of anyone. However, they did tell me that I wasn't the first delivery driver to report something strange happening in this area. The sedan I'd seen earlier had been linked to a string of similar reports, all from delivery drivers who had received fake orders at vacant houses. The drivers, thinking they were at legitimate locations, had been followed by the car. What had happened to me was the closest anyone had come to being hurt. The man had been waiting in my car the whole time, just waiting for the right moment to make his move. The police told me the car had been stolen. As for the man, no one had seen him since that night. The house I had delivered to was still abandoned, just like the rest of the ones on that street. I never went back to that neighborhood. It was one of those slow, uneventful nights at work. I worked at a small, local diner on the edge of town. Most of the customers were regulars, the kind of people who showed up at the same time every evening, ordered the same meal, and left the same tip. It was quiet, routine, and I liked it that way. Around 10:30 p.m., a man came in. He wasn't a regular. He looked out of place, wearing a dark leather jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He took a seat at the counter, a few stools down from where I was wiping down the surface. His eyes never left the menu in front of him. He didn't seem interested in making small talk, which was fine by me. I went over to take his order. "Hey, what can I get for you?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. He looked up at me briefly, but his eyes were hard to read. He gave a quick nod, then said, "Coffee, black." I grabbed a mug and poured him a cup, still keeping my distance. There was something unsettling about him, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he was fidgeting with his hands, tapping his fingers against the counter, or how still he sat, like he was waiting for something. "Anything else?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "No," he replied, barely glancing at me. "Just the coffee." I went about my usual tasks, taking care of the other customers, cleaning the counter, and glancing back at him every now and then. He wasn't eating or drinking much, just staring into his cup, lost in thought. It was strange for someone to come into a diner at this hour and not order food, but I didn't say anything. Some people just wanted a moment of peace. An hour passed. The diner had emptied out, and I was about to close up for the night. The man was still sitting there, his coffee long gone, but he hadn't moved. I was just finishing up the last few tasks when I noticed something odd. He hadn't paid for his coffee yet. I went over to him, ready to remind him that it was time to close and that he needed to settle up. But before I could say anything, he stood up abruptly, causing me to freeze. "I'm done," he muttered under his breath, not looking at me. He reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of pulling out his wallet, he produced something else. A small, thin knife. My heart stopped for a second, and I instinctively took a step back. He didn't seem threatening, but there was something in the way he held the knife that made my blood run cold. "I'm just going to take care of something," he said quietly. Before I could react, he turned and walked out of the diner. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind trying to process what had just happened. Was it a robbery? Was he threatening me? Was I supposed to call the cops? I quickly grabbed the phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking as I gave them a description of the man and the car he had left in. I wasn't sure where he had gone, but I could still see the glint of the knife in my mind. The thought that I was alone in the diner at that hour made me nervous. It felt like an eternity before the police arrived. I had locked the doors and waited for them to come inside, my thoughts still racing. They questioned me briefly, asked if I had any idea who the man was, but I didn't. He was a stranger. "Do you know which direction he went?" one of the officers asked me. "I don't," I replied. "He just left, and I didn't see him get into a car. But he was acting really strange before he left, like he was waiting for something." They nodded and began their search. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and the knife. Was he dangerous? Was he targeting me? Or was I just an unlucky bystander? It didn't help that he had disappeared so quickly, leaving no trace behind. It wasn't until a week later that I found out what had happened. The police had managed to track down the man. Apparently, he had been caught on security footage at a nearby convenience store the same night, buying something, nothing suspicious, but it gave them a lead. They found him at an old apartment building on the outskirts of town. What they discovered was even stranger. The man had no criminal history. He had come to the town on business and was staying at a nearby hotel, just passing through when something in his mind snapped. According to his family, he had been dealing with some serious personal issues. The knife he had was something he had used earlier that night to carve a pattern into a piece of wood he was carrying. The police found no evidence of any dangerous intent in his actions, and they stated that he appeared more confused and disoriented than anything else. The whole thing felt surreal to me. At the time, I thought I was in danger, that something awful was about to happen. But it turned out to be something completely different, something far more unsettling in its own right. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I close up late at night. I'll never really understand what was going on in his mind, but I've learned one thing. You can never predict what kind of night you're in for when the world is quiet.